From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture.
At the time of this recording, there's snow on the ground. It seems like spring will never come, but actually many of our beekeepers are hard at work right now. They're in California pollinating California almonds. But right after that, they're going to be heading back into the state of Oregon, back into the Pacific Northwest, where they're going to do an array of pollinations. One of the most important is the pollination of highbush blueberry. Frequent listeners of the show know that there's a USDA Specialty Crop Research Initiative project to develop a pollination planner that I'm part of, but also a number of my colleagues at Washington State University, Michigan State University, and the University of Florida, with the goal of a tool that will help blueberry growers make better decisions on the pollination of their crop. Now, we've had a number of guests on the show from that project: Dr. Lisa DeVetter from Washington State University, Maxine Eratz, Stan Chabert, and this week we're welcoming Lauren Goldstein. Lauren's a master's student at Michigan State University in the Department of Entomology. She's supervised by Dr. Rufus Isaac, and she's focusing on a long-neglected topic that blueberry growers are really keen to know about. That is, does the strength of honeybee colonies affect pollination? Clearly, a lot of growers know that the number of colonies you put in an area is important to pollination, but what about the strength of the colonies that are delivered? In this episode, Lauren's going to talk about some practical ways that growers, some different options they have for evaluating the strength of colonies, and then get into how strength matters when it comes to the pollination of crops. So let's head back to blueberries this week with Lauren Goldstein on pollination. Lauren, I'm so excited to have you on pollination.
Thank you so much, Andoni. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm looking behind you, and we're on Zoom, and you've got a honeybee visiting blueberry flowers. And I imagine most people know that honeybee colonies are used widely for blueberry pollination. And I wanted you to walk us through some of the decisions that a grower is faced with when looking to rent colonies for blueberry pollination.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Honeybee colonies are commonly rented for blueberry pollination. So to reach maximum potential yield of blueberry, the blueberry flowers must be visited by bees during bloom for the fertilization of seeds, and more fertilized seeds leads to larger berries. So usually a specific stocking rate or number of hives per acre is recommended for growers to meet their pollination demands. And so a lot of things need to be taken into consideration when renting colonies for blueberry pollination, like the acreage of the farm, also the bloom timing of the specific cultivars on their farm. They also want to take into consideration placement of the colonies around their farm. Predicted weather during bloom might impact the number of colonies they decide to place on the farm. And then, of course, when we talk about numbers, we have to talk about cost per colony. And there's also been some suggestions that perhaps changing the stocking density for different cultivars might be important. So that is not a comprehensive list of all of the considerations, just a few to get the mind.
It's a lot. And I guess right now we were joking before we got on this, it's snowing in both our states, and that growers, but it's not that far away. Like if you look at, the blueberry plant, the shrubs look different than they did in midwinter. They're changing, they're getting ready. And I imagine growers are trying to do this all these calculations in their head as what variety do I have, and what's my acreage, and how many colonies, and where are they going to go?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there might be icicles on the shoots, but there's spring under there somewhere. And yeah, growers are definitely getting ready to make these kinds of decisions.
Well, and it's good to know. And I do want to point out for people who didn't listen, we had an episode with Maxine Eratz and Stan Chabert down in University of Florida, talking about that very thing about the cultivar and still being worked out, like, if you've got this cultivar, that cultivar, but also the stocking rate and, area-wide stocking rate. But I guess this is the thing, the stocking rate is one of the things that a grower has control over. When they contract a beekeeper, they say, I want this many colonies or this many colonies per area. That's something that they can adjust. They can go higher or lower. And I guess what is a little bit more difficult for growers in blueberry to assess, because you got so many colonies that came in, you got this much area, you can calculate colonies per acre. But what's a little more difficult is what's in those colonies, the strength of those colonies. Can you walk us through how a grower traditionally assesses the strength of the colony?
Yeah, absolutely. So at least here in Michigan, blueberry growers don't often traditionally assess colony strength. I mean, they might walk around the farm or drive past with a window rolled down and look at bees flying in and out to roughly gauge strength. But they're not often opening colonies on their own. I know that in almonds and some other maybe more high value production systems, growers will contract a third-party broker, say a hive grader, to randomly sample a subset of colonies on a farm and perform hive strength assessments. And this is usually done using the cluster count method. And in this method, the observer will estimate the number of frames of bees in a colony by identifying full seams of bees between frames.
Seam? Tell us what that is.
Yeah. So when we say seam, beekeeping speak, we mean like the density of bees between frames, between the tops of frames when you're viewing a hive box from above. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, so I can imagine you open up a bee colony, take the lid off, and you've got the frames running lengthwise. And if you look between that little gap and they're full of bees, that would be like a full seam. But if they were like only half, then it would be a half seam. That kind of tells you what's inside.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Okay, so that's how it's done traditionally. Sorry, I interrupted you there. I'm not sure if you wanted to expand on this, but this is the way growers traditionally. And I think we have the same experience here in Oregon. I think in blueberries, and also where I've worked in British Columbia and I've worked in low bush blueberry in Nova Scotia, people didn't know what was in the colonies. They would drive by and say, these look like they have a lot of activity, but they aren't entirely sure what's inside. But in almonds, as you point out, the beekeepers that are down there, they may even get a bonus if they have more of these seams of bees than others. Okay, so thanks for setting that up. So tell us, you've been interested in this question. The colony strength thing is sort of the focus of your graduate work. Yeah. Tell us about what you've been doing. Tell us about some of these. You've been interested in alternate methods for assessing colonies above cluster counts. How are you comparing these different methods?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you mentioned, assessing honeybee colony size is critical to maximizing crop pollination. And this might lead to maybe bonuses in stronger colonies. But like we talked about, the cluster count method, it's done by visual observation, and this can be biased. It's also somewhat physically taxing and time consuming, especially with the density of colonies typically found in a commercial crop production field. It would be very difficult to effectively measure the size of all rented hives. The last thing to point out is that the cluster count method can be somewhat disruptive to the colony. Honeybees are living their lives in the dark. And so anytime you open up the colony to the elements, that might be disruptive to them. And so there has been a need or a call for the validation of some rapid non-invasive methods of estimating colony size. And so I have investigated my graduate work, a couple of different methods. First being the returning forager count method, which I think was first suggested by Ramesh Sagili and then validated by you and one of your undergraduates, Kennedy Grant and Lisa DeBetter. And so this method is performed by counting the number of forager bees that are returning to a colony from the field. So this should be done in optimal weather conditions. And of course that varies by region, but we just don't want there to be any wind. It should be somewhat warm, but not too hot. We like to say greater than 65 degrees Fahrenheit, but this is not always feasible during bloom in many production regions.
Yeah, blueberry, it can be cold a
Yeah,
lot of the time. Getting that 65 Fahrenheit is hard.
right. It can be cold. So I would say aim for little to no wind and little to no precipitation.
And so what are you doing? You're
standing
just
in front of the colony and literally counting the number of bees that are entering the hive.
I imagine if a colony is not that strong, it's not that hard to do because, you know, in a minute, there's maybe, I don't know, 20 or something. But
right.
How do you do it on like a real strong colony, like one that's really booming?
Yeah. So in our work, we use a smartphone camera to record the entrance of the colony, and then we watch it back in slow motion in order to be able to count all the individual bees.
Okay.
However, I would say that if you can't count the number of bees, the exact number of bees entering the colony, that's a strong colony. That's a general.
That's great. Okay. Nice rule of thumb. I love that.
Yeah, it's a very rough rule of thumb, but I think it works. So that's the returning forager count method. And I think that is very feasible and reliable for a grower to perform. This method has been validated several times, and I have found that it is always directly proportional with the cluster count colony size. So I think and across a lot of different weather conditions too. So I think it's a really reliable method.
But the downside is to really do it accurately. If you wanted to do it accurately, it's a lot of, you know, I remember you talking about the time taken to open the colony, but I imagine to count those videos of 100 bees returning is also a lot of time.
Right. So if you wanted to do it very accurately, if you wanted to exactly match up, let's say 100 foragers is a 12 frame colony. If you wanted to exactly gauge the number of frames in your colony, that would take a lot of time. But I'd say if you're just walking around and staring at each colony for 1 minute, which 1 minute is really a lot shorter than the amount of time it might take to perform a cluster count on a colony if you're inexperienced, and you're just doing a rough gauge. All right, I can't count the number of bees going into this hive. I'm going to call it strong. I'd say that is a faster method of estimating colony strength than the cluster count method.
Okay, super. So we've got this maybe, but very quick kind of assessment method may have some limitations. What else have you looked at?
Yeah. So the fastest method is the infrared image assessment method. So this has been suggested for a while. So in this method, an infrared camera is used to capture a thermal image of the hive. And then the heat signature from the image can be interpreted to understand the size of the adult bee cluster inside. And so I specifically worked with the B Corp to field test their Verifly product, which translates this infrared image data into a frame count score by analyzing thermal pixels using their proprietary model. And their model is flexible and can be updated as they improve their methods. So as a grower, you might contract Verifly to perform this service for you. Or I can see down the line a situation in which you can rent a thermal camera, image all of your hives, and then send that data back to the B Corp, and they can provide individual frame count estimations for you.
Okay, this makes sense. So you would take a picture, and then it would, I can imagine it glows red where there's a lot of bees and it's, you know, not that. And then you can sort of like get a sense of how much of that box is occupied.
Yes, that's exactly the
okay,
sense.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, don't be sorry. Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah. So at the moment, Verifly is only reporting an average frame strength on a field. So they will go out right now. This is happening a lot in almonds. So they'll go out into an almond production, image all of the hives on a field, determine an average frame strength per field and report that back to the grower. So what I was interested in my work was to determine if Verifly was able to do this, but on an individual hive basis, so that beekeepers or growers can target individual hives for remedial management. Let's say this hive is not strong enough, so we'll pull it out. And then the grower might not have to pay for that hive in that instance. Or on the flip side, if a beekeeper wants to use this type of product to image their hives before even bringing them to the field, that brings us back to our whole kind of speculation about getting bonuses for stronger hives. Maybe a beekeeper could get a bonus if all of the hives were verifiably strong. That was a plan that I did not intend.
Okay. Yeah. No. Okay. That's great. So that I can see the reason for asking the question for individual colonies, because it could, the average is good to know, but if you wanted to say, 10% of the colonies were below grade, I need a discount, or boy, those, 10% of your colonies are really strong. And I like the idea for a beekeeper as well. Coming in, they can, they can do their own grading on their end and be able to say, I'm delivering really strong colonies. This should be worth an extra $10 or something.
Right. Exactly.
Great. Okay. Yeah.
If you could have a third party provide that information, I think it would be more trustworthy for the grower as well.
Mm-hmm. And okay. Well, here, I got a plan. Let's take a quick break. I want to leave it on a cliffhanger, and then we'll come back and find out what you found. So let's cue the music. Here it comes. And we're back. Okay, so we were just talking at the break, and you were pointing out that, and I remember this. I remember I've seen beekeepers here in Oregon. They go to the hardware store, and they get these thermal imaging things. And in the winter, this time of year, just kind of as a kind of hobby beekeeper, somebody with a few colonies, it's like a fun thing is you can go out and put that on your thermal imaging camera on your colony in your cluster, and it's like, oh, they're alive. Tell us, this is a little bit more than that.
Yeah, exactly. I think what you just described is kind of like the beta version of the Verifly product. So it is useful though as a hobbyist to just be able to see how the cluster inside your colony is changing throughout the winter and even early spring. And so I think the point of the Verifly product is just to further expand on that. And, they use this algorithm to make more exact predictions, but hobbyist beekeepers can do something similar with these, over the counter products you can get at the hardware store. Even there's these phone attachments, and, just exploring what's going on inside your colonies and watching how it changes, watching how the biology changes throughout the season. I think can be not only really interesting, but useful to help you grow as a hobbyist beekeeper.
But these cameras that are being used for the Verifly they are expensive, fancy thermal imaging cameras.
Exactly. These are the FLIR E8, I think is what they use, thermal cameras. These are several $1,000s a pop. And so it's not something that a beekeeper could usually feasibly go out and get on their own, but there definitely are products that, what you really can't get is this algorithm. They have physicists and biologists and lots of really smart people on their team that are constantly building up this model to make it the predictive power greater. And so that's really what you can't get as a hobbyist, but any thermal imaging tool can be used to just observe what's happening inside your hive.
Well, this is great. And I think this is the first time I've seen somebody compare these different methodologies. It's going to be I'm really excited to see your data. It's going to give growers a sense of this costs this much, and this takes this much time, and this is the data I get back.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a fantastic study. But one thing I do want to move on to is that you've been, there's a question of, so what? It's does colony stocking rate, you have these two factors, colony stocking rate, and now this other factor that you may be able to control for or incentivize colony strength. Mm-hmm. And, how do these things interact? I imagine you might be able to compensate for low colony strength with more, there must be some tell us a little bit about what you're finding about these two factors and how they work together.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So far, our research in high bush blueberry, at least, indicates that bee activity on a farm may be a more significant indicator of fruit yield than the number of hives on a farm.
Huh.
So the validity of this stocking rate recommendation alone I think I am calling into question. I don't want to say is being called into question, but I am calling into question. As we've discussed, the number of adult foragers available for pollination in a single hive varies widely. And to make a blanket statement that 3 hives per acre will satisfy your pollination demands, I think is not really fully capturing the actual bee activity that you're bringing onto a farm. So, of course, other things can influence that recommendation. So, for example, in Michigan, in 2021, we had a somewhat normal, I say with air quotes, pollination year where our phenology was broad and we had flowers opening across cultivars at all different times. So bees had enough time to get to all the flowers and pollinate them multiple times. In 2022, we had very truncated bloom period. So our phenology was way off. By phenology, I mean like the progression of flower opening.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So that was very truncated. So across cultivars, we had lots of flowers open at the same time, but the same number of hives on the field as the previous year. So the way I think about that is like the same number of bees had to do.
Oh, way more flowers at once.
Right.
Oh, so the flower to bee ratio is like there's fewer bees to flowers in a bloom period that's like all at once.
Right, exactly.
Gotcha.
And that's why we say bee activity might be a more significant indicator than hives per acre, because bee activity is really a measure of honeybee floral visitation. So how many bees are actually on flowers? So like I said, colony strength can influence that. So, a 3-frame colony is going to provide far fewer bees to a field than a 14-frame colony. And then, weather and phenology can influence that as well.
Okay, that's great. So that is a fascinating finding. I imagine you were surprised because, you're looking at these other variables, but, the way in which the bloom comes on ends up being like this big driver, because no matter how many, if you had strong colonies, they're going to be spread over this bloom, and that really can influence. It's almost like that's a factor. We're talking about factors under a grower's control.
Right.
And here's a factor not under the grower's control at all.
Right, exactly. But I think that if a grower could use some sort of, whether it's a weather prediction tool or a bloom phenology tool to predict what phenology is going to look like that year, with enough time before colony rental happens, they might be able to say, okay, this year I need to rent way more colonies than I did last year because we're going to have way shorter bloom period. And so we need to have a lot more bees here to handle all the flowers. This is not an official recommendation. This is just, I'm speculating what might be a solution in years when phenology is different. But I think as a general recommendation, stocking strong colonies at a high enough rate to meet your pollination demands is like a general safeguard for growers. So
that's great. And I guess, I was sort of reticent not to mention this earlier, but we're part of a large team that's taking all of this information. Like we had Stan on talking about cultivar, we had Maxime talking about landscape level, and this is all in some level going to be rendered out in a tool.
Right.
A kind of something that a grower can then, she or he can plug in all this stuff and then be able to like, oh,
yeah,
right. I know what I need now. The weather. I have enough confidence that this is going to be a short, sharp. I imagine it's going to be this year.
Right.
It's just going to come on as soon as it gets warm. If it gets warm, it's just going to go. Whew.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's the idea. And so you were asking me about how to combine these metrics, right? Like we have stocking rate, which is hives per acre, and then we have colony strength, which is the number of bees in a hive. And so the way that I've been kind of framing this is by thinking about it as a cluster count per acre.
Okay. That makes sense, because you're always thinking about, I was thinking about one versus the other, but you can combine them in the one metric.
Right, exactly. So the way that I have kind of gone about this is to randomly sample 10 hives on a field for cluster count, and then take the average cluster count across those 10 hives to get one average cluster count and multiply that across the number of hives on a field. That way we can get a cluster count per field and kind of use that to relate to yield outcomes.
Oh, that's amazing. So you're kind of like you're kind of integrating the two together, and that will give you a sense of like, if you have fewer colonies with you have a certain amount of frames, but the more colonies will sort of make up those frames per acre. But you could also just have a really good strong colony, a bunch of really strong colonies, and that might get you to the same number. Oh, that's a great way of doing it. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I guess the one thing I sometimes I think about is this is with colony strength from the beekeeper side. I sometimes think that beekeepers are, on their end struggling when the colonies are too strong. I know in blueberry is always tradition. I ran into some person who would go to the blueberry fields with boxes in trees just to catch all the swarms. And I imagine on a beekeeper's end, coming in strong has its challenges. If they're a little bit weaker and they can grow through pollination, it's an easier prospect for them.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And that is something that, colony strength in blueberry specifically is a very popular topic. I think at least in Michigan, beekeepers often, complain about weakened colonies coming out of pollination. And what I have personally seen is an increase in colony size throughout the bloom period, at least when performing cluster counts. I've begun to wonder if that is somewhat of a biased observation. So oftentimes beekeepers will come in the middle of bloom and add a honey super onto all of their colonies, expecting them to grow. And so I'm now wondering if we come in as hive graders and see an extra hive box and think that it's a larger colony and then add frames to our estimate. And so that's why maybe some of these returning forager counts or infrared image analysis might be more useful measures of estimating colony strength. We might be able to validate this, concern of beekeepers of what's happening to my colonies. Why are they, weakened after blueberry pollination?
We see the same thing in Oregon. I think when Kennedy had done her work, she found that the grading before and after, and there's a lot of data from this study from before and after grading, that the colonies do generally grow. But if I often hear from beekeepers, it's what happens afterwards. So after they leave pollination, there seems to be some kind of an issue, but it is a whole, it's a whole, other episode, just, the kind of challenges that beekeepers have with blueberry pollination. But I really do think this tool kind of brings some, solid science to something that I think people have known was an issue and known was important, but not exactly sure how to think about. So I'm really excited to see as your work comes into publication. I think all of us are really excited. Growers and beekeepers here in Oregon are excited to see how this all turns out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be doing the work. And of course, ultimately, I just hope that it can help beekeepers and growers make management decisions. So we'll keep you posted.
Okay, well, let's take a quick another break. We have a set of questions we ask all our guests. I'm excited to ask them to you.
Great, thanks.
Okay, we are back. So this is the segment where we get to learn a little bit about you, outside your research. And I guess the first question we have is, do you have a book recommendation for our listeners?
I do, yes. So I have 2 book recommendations for listeners. For anybody who's interested in a bee-themed read, I highly recommend Bee Time by Mark L. Winston. That was gifted to me by my advisor, Rufus Isaacs. And it just made me very excited to pursue my graduate work, working with honeybees. It has like a very, I don't know the right word, but spiritual is definitely not the right word, but it's a less like scientific look at working with honeybees and more of a just personal take.
Well, The thing, I was one of Mark's students.
Oh,
and
wow.
so, yeah, no, it was great. He was wonderful to work with. But I do remember one of the chapters on CamJ, and it was no joke. I have CamJ's in my mind, Manitoba's in my mind because their provincial apiculturalist, Riel Lafreniere, just retired. But I remember the story of CamJ flying his plane around and delivering. Had an empty pizza box in his back seat, and whenever you land at somebody doing ice fishing, he'd say, "Anybody order pizza?"
It's so great. I love that.
There's a lot of personalities and it's a great book for kind of getting at sort of the deeper motivations for people, and Eva Crane and all those people, amazing people. Great recommendation. I don't know if it's been recommended before, so I'm really glad that you recommended it.
Awesome. Great. I'm glad to hear it. And that's also cool to learn that you were one of Mark's students. I had no idea. So that's awesome. Okay. My second recommendation for people who don't care about reading about bees, if you work with bees and you just need a break from bees, is The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. I know John Green is like a very basic author and everybody reads John Green, but it's a great book just about like humanity and experiencing life as a person. So I think we can learn a lot about actually our working with insects and biology by taking a deeper look at ourselves.
Fantastic. What a great recommendation. That's awesome. And I can see a connection between the two of the books, I think.
There is certainly a connection. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. Well, that moves us on to what is your indispensable tool for the kind of work that you do?
Yeah. I know I should probably say a bee suit. But I'm not going to. I'm going to say my cell phone, my smartphone. So like I mentioned, with the returning forager count method, to do it as accurately as possible, you definitely want to record it to count every individual bee. So I took hundreds of hours of video footage on my phone over the past 2 pollination seasons. So I couldn't do it without my phone. I also just love taking pictures of hives.
Tell us. This is a great opportunity for us to tell. How do you video tape a returning forager? Tell us, what do you do?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that before. So in our first year of the study, I would just put on my bee suit and stand in front of the hive, but off to the side. And I would zoom in on my camera to ensure that I was only taping the hive entrance or any other possible holes on the hive. Sometimes there's auger holes, or maybe there's just holes in the equipment. So you want to make sure you're getting all of the entrances. But usually,
and I imagine the off to the side is so that you're not in the direct path of the bees flying, so they don't all pile up like at O'Hare Airport or something.
Yes, exactly. You don't want them all piling up on you. And it also is disruptive to the flight path, so you won't get an accurate, view of actually what's going on. That's what we did the first year. And then the second year, we realized we could just hook up our phones to a smartphone tripod, place that in front of the hive, and then walk away for a minute.
What a good idea.
Yeah, so that ended up working really nice. We just got really short tripods and they just stood right in front of the hive entrance. The bees didn't care about them at all. They went right through the legs of the tripod into their hive. So it was pretty good.
Well, I remember we're all working together on a video to show people how to do this hive entrance count. I did just get a comment from Dr. Lisa DeVetter at Washington State University, and she said, "Remember to tell people to cut the grass in front of the colony."
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to make one comment about that. If you're a grower and you want to do this observation, if you're going to cut the grass or mat it down, I would recommend walking away for 10 minutes and then coming back, because I do think that activity in front of the hive entrance does have a disruptive effect. And I think oftentimes the bees will try to find another entrance to enter or just leave and come back.
Oh yeah, my place had grass out front. This isn't my place.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. I'd recommend taking a break and coming back after doing that.
Well, and the importance of doing this, I think, why do you need to cut the grass in the first place is the first question.
Yeah. I think the obvious reason is so that it's not obstructive to your view. If there's grass in front of the hive entrance, it's harder to see every single individual bee going inside. You also, that's the simple answer.
Oh, no. What's the more complicated answer?
Well, I would say that, grass could be considered somewhat of an entrance reducer, especially if it's thick grass. And if you have an entrance reducer, you're going to have far fewer bees going in per minute. than a hive entrance that's totally unobstructed. So in order to just keep your observations consistent across hives, you don't want to have any sort of entrance reducers on.
Okay, fantastic. Well, the phone. Okay, so the last question that we ask is, do you have a favorite pollinator species? And there's a honeybee right on your shoulder right now. So
I really should say honeybees, and I love honeybees and just their biology and, sociality. So cool. But I think I'm going to have to give it to the monarch butterfly. I grew up in Coral Springs, Florida, which is right next door to Coconut Creek, Florida, which has been lovingly named as the butterfly capital of the world. And so I just developed a very deep love for monarch butterflies as a child living so close to Coconut Creek. And I used to purchase monarch caterpillar chrysalises and rear them in cups and then release them into my backyard. Don't do that. I don't think that's good to do biologically, but as a kid I would do it, and it really just instilled a deep love of biology and insects specifically at a young age.
There's something about, one of my favorite authors is Gerald Durrell, My Family and Other Animals. And just, there's something about handling, I sometimes think entomology education often is just pictures these days, but there's something about handling, live creatures and having them go through their life cycles. It just makes your imagination go wild.
Yeah, it really does. I couldn't agree more.
Well, it's been a delight to have you on the show. I'm really excited to see how your research develops. And thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on this today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a joy.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sin and Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.